"55 hours later, Xander sat on his foredeck watching Jamaica's distant mountains materialize in a rugged blue line on the horizon. He shivered with foreboding. Why couldn't some sort of resolution have been achieved while he still had hundreds of miles of miserable water separating him from that hostile land and a situation that could cost him his reputation? Ginny came on deck and began hoisting the yellow piece of fabric she called a Q flag. The quarantine flag signaled immigration authorities that they intended to land. Once his boat had been properly processed and inspected, Ginny or Mike would take down the Q and hoist the 8 inches by 10 inches replica of the Jamaican flag, which Ginny had painted. Having the country's flag flying showed that his boat had been properly processed and was legal. This eliminated many political problems, but it also created a record of where Whispering Winds was as well as the dates he was in a specific country, and if his suspicions about Jamaica being a canine stronghold were fact, then official documentation gave them information he would have preferred they didn't have. And he would bet his flea collar that he was about to enter a canine-controlled port. His stomach nodded with the certainty that he personally needed to do something about Dame Esmeralda. Or at least appear to do something about the trail, which had gone cold somewhere on the other side of those distant blue mountains. Whiskers drooping, Xander went below and studied the chart lying on the table for what seemed like the 100th time. No matter how many times he examined the maps, Jamaica looked like a harsh rock stuck in the Caribbean Sea. Hoping that a closer inspection would reveal more roads or at least something good, he climbed onto the table, sat on top of the chart and began by scrutinizing the area surrounding Port Antonio's marina, where he would land. Though it lay less than a tail's length from Kingston, where the crime had taken place, the island appeared to have more rivers than roads. He shuddered at the possibility of still needing to use boats to get around once he got on land. Xander focused on the thin gray line meandering along the shore before it zigzagged into the mountains. While it appeared to be the main road, it certainly didn't have the feel of an interstate. Puerto Rico's interstate hadn't been anything like home, and some of the side roads Mike had driven over had potholes so large that Mike literally drove the rental car into them, then out the far side. He shuddered at the memory. One hole had been large enough to bury most of a pickup truck that had gotten stuck in the bottom as the tide came in. He had quickly learned that road quality varied drastically when their rental car had gone airborne rocketing out of one of Puerto Rico's huge potholes. Since Jamaica was even smaller than Puerto Rico and the maps showed fewer roads, he feared the roads could be smaller and the holes larger. He closed his eyes and controlled his breathing. What would be and worry would not change the situation. The mansion from which Dame Esmeralda had been catnapped was on the south side of the island, while Port Antonio was on the north shore. Somehow, he needed to find a nice dry way to get to the scene of the crime, but it didn't look promising. He slapped the chart with his tail. Mike put down his book. Off the table. You know better than that. Xander hopped down, shocked at being caught, embarrassed at being so upset by the situation that he hadn't paid attention to the obvious fact that Mike was less than 10 feet away. Details were important, more than most ever realized. Xander sprinted back into the cockpit, hopped onto the rail, squinted at the island's peaks and assured himself that the distance across such a rugged land would be as good a reason for him not to become any more directly involved than he had been from the middle of the sea. Surely he could continue to use the internet to answer Sir Simon's constant questions about how to solve the crime. By the time Ginny piloted Whispering Winds through the narrow channel into a pretty round harbor, Xander had convinced himself everything would be fine. A seagull swooped through the air and screeched, as if congratulating him on his insight. He blinked in surprise. After spending the past 3 months in the Bahamas, he hadn't realized how much he'd missed watching gulls, birds in general, for that matter. Not that there weren't birds in the Bahamas, he'd heard a few singing in the short, hardy shrubbery, which cloaked the dry, rocky little islands, but there certainly hadn't been any silly, self-important gulls. As Ginny pulled into a slip at the marina's dock, 3 humans rushed from a large colonial-style building to catch the lines Mike threw. Within minutes, Whispering Winds was secured to the concrete and wood dock. While Mike stood on the forward deck chatting, Ginny placed their 3 fat white bumpers between the fiberglass hull and the rough dock. Assured that they were doing their jobs properly, Xander watched gulls swoop into the water and come up with nothing but claws dripping water. At last, one gull caught a thrashing silverfish, but as it struggled to regain altitude and reach shore, it was bombarded by its relatives. As they fought for the frantic fish, it dropped back into the dark water with a silvery flash, twisted once, then disappeared. Ah, yes, he definitely missed watching those stupid birds. Xander inhaled the strangely scented air. You're the great kamikaze, aren't you? Startled that someone had managed to sneak up on him, he played it cool as he slowly turned to face a cute black and white feline with huge golden eyes, who was sitting on the dock. I'm Xander. I knew it. I knew it. I knew it. Whiskers twirling with excitement, she danced a little jig. Just wait till I tell everyone that you're here. Of course, Simon knew you'd come, but everyone thought he was simply certifiable. It's like you're the most amazing Tom, but I guess everyone tells you that, don't they? He smiled, uncertain about how to respond, then what she'd said sank in. You know Simon? Well, of course. Simply everyone knows him. This was not the best news. So it's easy to get to Kingston from here? Oh, I wouldn't know. She gave him a huge smile. The Omaha say, ask questions from your heart and you will be answered from the heart. Was the girl daft or had he missed some sort of cultural nuance concerning a locally important family named Omaha? Xander tried, again, isn't Kingston where Simon lives, if you say so? Another smile. You aren't afraid of anything, are you? Why do you say that? Well, I've never met any cat that actually stood on deck when their boat came into port, but there you were, bigger than life. Well, not really bigger, because you're really the size you are, but you know what I mean. There you were right up there on deck, talking to Julio and not being a bit afraid of him mistaking you for a fish and trying to bite you or anything. And you named the boat, didn't you? I beg your pardon. She looked up. So did he? Are you referring to that seagull? Well, of course I am. Oh, stupid bird that he is, he probably didn't give you his name, did he? Of course he wouldn't because birds never seem to understand the proper way to greet anyone or even know what to do or say when they do. Xander stared at her in amazement, noting that the bird was not the only one who had failed at displaying proper protocol. I think you're the most amazing Tom I ever met. Coming here and sitting right there in the open, chatting with Julio and Heather only knows what goes through that bird's mind. Seagulls interest me. Her eyes widened, so he explained, I find the way they always seem to act pompous amusing particularly because they never really manage to be. Gads, he was starting to be as much of a gabby-tabby as what's her name was. Excuse me, but I don't recall your name. Her pale pink nose deepened to red and she lowered her gaze. Sharky. He leaned forward to hear her as she addressed the concrete wharf. Actually, it's really shark bait, but my humans generally called me Sharky and acted like they really like being owned by me. By now, she seemed to be muttering more to her paws than talking to him. He didn't know how to respond to this, so said nothing. After all, what could he say to a girl named Sharkbait? I know it's a horrid name, but it's the only one I've ever had. She seemed so miserable, he looked around for something else to talk about, but thoughts of consoling her were forgotten when he saw Sea-Paw's red prow coming into the harbor. Heather help him, the last thing he needed was to deal with Valentine, particularly when the mutt might overhear Gabby Ms. Sharky, who knew his title and reason for being in Jamaica. Xander leapt onto the dock, landing lightly next to her. How about you show me your town? Me? Her voice squeaked. You don't mind being seen with me? He looked her up and down. Why should I? But everyone around here knows my name. So? She blinked in confusion. He had to get her moving before Valentine got close enough to see which way they'd gone. I think Sharky is a cute name. It sure beats Hairball. He took a step toward the main pier. Now, he had salt-slick decks, sometimes mosquitoes or itty-bitty biting bugs, and occasionally flying fish, which appeared with the dawn. It was no wonder he felt so stressed out by the Red Claw situation that hung over him like a dismal fate when he had no way to relax and see his way through problems or someone to bounce ideas against. He shook his head to help orient himself. Are you feeling okay? Sharky asked. Certainly, he said, but her expressive eyes told him that she could see the lie, so he admitted, I still feel like I'm bouncing about on the waves. Her eyes widened with concern. Mike gets this feeling, too. He calls it land sickness. Sharky sat down with a graceless thump. It's not contagious, he assured her. For several moments, they sat side by side in the shade of the papery thin orange and pink flowers and watched a black butterfly with yellow spots flutter from one blossom to the other. I've heard of seasickness, she said softly. He nodded. It's more common, but ultimately the same problem. She looked at him, her expression confused. For seasickness, a cat can't adjust to the movement of the boat. It takes me a day or so to get used to the ground not moving. He gave her a small smile. You really are a Tom of the sea, aren't you? Admiration suffused her tone. Was he? Xander batted an ear. I'm working on it. Sea Paws nosed into a slip on the other side of a powerboat. If he wanted to leave without Valentine seeing which way he'd gone, now was the ideal time, even if it felt like a gerbil was careening around in his stomach. The best way to get used to being on solid ground is to walk. He stood up. So did she. With a flick of his ear, he indicated that she should lead the way. Without being prompted, she took a serpentine route through the lush shrubbery, which surrounded the building. Pleased with the route she'd taken to mask their movements from everything but the most dedicated spy network, he waited to see what she'd do once they got past the thriving vegetation. Several feet before the road, she suddenly sat down and began to identify the various plants around them. Then she walked to the base of a huge tree. This is a breadfruit tree. Unlike bananas and coconuts, they're worth climbing. It reminded him of a white oak he'd often sharpened his claws on. No branches, she murmured. Well, how am I supposed to gain insider knowledge of things like this without someone like you? She looked at him, still unconvinced. I research what I can think to ask, but it never occurred to me that some local trees might not have branches. There must be all sorts of information you know about this place that I'll need. She sat up a bit straighter. Xander smiled. It felt good to make the cute little gal feel better about herself, even if he doubted that he'd ever need to know about bark quality of local trees, since it was obvious which ones had branches, which had leaves large enough to hide in, and which had such thin leaves that even a wren couldn't hide in its boughs. A chorus of barking erupted near the marina. He studied the area they'd just come from to see what the dogs were up to. Across the harbor, 4 rail thin brown dogs ran onto a barely visible sandbar. Noses high, they appeared to be shouting to Valentine, who stood looking at them from Sea Paw's bow. Ears straining, he tried to understand the dialect. Don't mind that riffraff, Sharky's nose wrinkled. They're just begging from the fat red one. You don't think much of them, he observed. With a twitch of her ear, she agreed. He studied the scraggly pack some more. Their location was ideal to observe the comings and goings of the harbor, things they probably report to Dog Central along with the more important information. And, like the worst novice, he'd been standing on the bow when Whispering Winds sailed past their spy post. By now, every dog on the planet probably knew exactly where he was. And, assuming they were involved in the catnapping, they almost certainly knew why he'd come to Jamaica. The more they spoke in code with Valentine, the more certain Xander became that the annoying red boxer was spying on him, and the more he began to recognize that sneaking aboard Whispering Winds on the night he'd received the red claw alert might have been more cunning than coincidence. And if Valentine's sneaky visit had been planned, then it stood to reason that the dogs were definitely behind Dame Esmeralda's abduction, and the entire situation could be a trap for him to reveal himself, or Catamondo's Purrtector network, at very least a way to ensnare poor Simon in a mess he had no hope of winning, which would bring down one Purrtector. Since Simon did not appear to be the most able Purrtector in Catamondo, and since Dame Esmeralda was Lady Montgomery's littermate, Xander understood why the canines had chosen to test the Purrtectors in Jamaica. Valentine issued a command to the thin brown mutts. The 4 mongrels turned with military precision and disappeared into the mangroves, presumably to issue some sort of report. With that sort of cowering obedience, Valentine must be higher in dogdom than he'd thought possible for anything that smelled so vile. He needed to find better agents to infiltrate the dog's network. Now that he'd unmasked Valentine, he'd have to keep a steady eye on him. When it was possible, it simply wasn't feasible when he needed to get away from the dogs, not so secret agent without leaving any trail. But how could he get away from the boxer and help Simon foil the dog's evil plan? He looked around, his gaze settling on the freshly scarred trunk. Heather, what had he been thinking when he left such an obvious sign? He might as well have shot off a flare. The white underbark blazed like a beacon. This was the second time today he'd done something so stupid that even the youngest kitten would know better. He looked heavenward, barely noticing the thick, strong branches and the way many of them interlaced with vines and other trees. Then, inspiration struck. Ever climbed this one? She blinked in such an odd way as she peered skyward that he wondered if she'd ever climbed a tree. Must be a grand view from up there. Bet you're right. Without waiting a moment more, he sank all claws into the trunk and hurried upward, fully expecting her to run home before anyone missed her. Halfway to the top, he dashed out onto a limb, which intersected with a huge branch from the next tree. He moved from tree to tree in this way a dozen more times, each new tree taking him farther away from the marina, until he couldn't even see the harbor. Knowing there wasn't a dog born that could track him through the boughs, he slowed his pace to enjoy the unexpected adventure. After his arboreal path took him over the ridge, there were more houses and fewer trees, so he had to slow down enough to plan his route. By the time the sun was high, he'd worked his way to the other side of town. Before he got any farther, he needed a plan. Xander sprawled on a comfortable branch which offered a view of the most traveled road, yet camouflaged him behind wide, green, fiddle-shaped leaves. Slowly, he eased into a zen-like state and let his mind run free. "They should call you Tarzan," a familiar voice said. A red-orange flower larger than her head lay wilted across her back, trapped by a cobweb, which had snagged her right ear. "What happened to you? What do you mean?" Sharky asked. He sat up and carefully removed the flower. "Oh, that must have happened when I took that wrong turn in the flame of the forest." Xander's fur tingled. "You went through fire? Whatever gave you that idea?" He arched a brow. "Oh, no. Flame of the forest is the name of the tree that those flower grows on." She gently tapped the limp petal. "I think it's 'cause the color makes it look like the trees are on fire." "Fascinating. So, what you doing here?" "Studying patterns." He curled his tail around his toes as he assumed his most dignified professorial posture. "How often do you look up?" "You mean when I hear a bird?" "Anytime." Sharky thought hard. "Not too often," she admitted, shamefaced. "That's the lesson, isn't it? Being up in a tree is a good place to watch from because no one looks up here to see who is watching them, so they go on about their business like regular." "Precisely. You're smart to understand." Her eyes gleamed like polished brass. "It's best to get comfortable and be as quiet as possible." Without needing to be more blunt, Sharky settled herself on the branch. The kid had potential, he thought as he returned to his zen state.